All right, so I'll be starting in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1, go. Speaker, the problem with the Prime Minister's speech exactly is that it's completely unclear what the exact objectives they are trying to achieve in their side of the world is. Because if what you're looking for is participation or encouraging local sportsmen or individuals who engage in sporting activities in local sports and to have at least something to be able to do, we still think that in itself valuably exists. If what you're looking for is to have some kind of upward mobility for people to rise to become elite sports stars, we still think that exists in our current status quo. So we don't really get much of a distinction with how this government policy is bound to change the kind of societies we're looking for in itself. But 3 levels of response I'm going to give. The first thing is that the sort of egalitarian principle OG preaches is not what exists in sport. We think the necessary nature of sport is that resources and abilities are always asymmetrical. There's always a difference between the top playing stars and the low feeder teams in itself. This is exactly how sport exists because of competition is extremely probabilistic. So 2 people can't win in many instances at the same time. So there's always one person who is going to be on top and someone else who's going to be at the bottom. Necessarily, that is the nature of which sports exist in. So you can't have everyone being elite sports stars at the same time. This is the reason why the society exists in factions. The same way you have like this in government regions. You have the high sports regions and you have the lower sports regions where individuals engage in different levels, right? We think those classifications exist because that's necessarily how society is structured in the first place. The implications of this is that government then responds to this by recognizing these factors and puts their money where they feel is the most practically utilitarian for any society to do in the first place. Why? 2 things. There's a distinctive difference between the sports and athletes you have in local things like local regional sports activities, like local tournaments. These people are not top pro athletes. These people are not the mainstream, competitive athletes you have in society. Meaning, in most instances, things like amateur football clubs are majorly just created for maybe student programs, unity programs, exactly, right? But there's a complete difference where you have top-grade international competition like the Olympics or Premier League, etc. The implications of this is that these things get the exact amount of funding, they necessarily have the value ascribed towards it. So the kind of value attached towards these levels of activities determines the kind of funding that is going to exist in the first place. So in the event where you say, oh, government should direct their fundings towards local grassroots activities, you don't give us the primary incentives for government to want to do this, especially when they don't see the intrinsic value in this in the first place. We think that is something that they completely misunderstand on the side of the house. But then we're going to engage even a more sophisticated idea that would have come from government or the entire government bench in itself. This is in 3 ways. The first you need to understand is that the differences that exist in sports mean that you have funding based on the exact amount of capital interest and the kind of value utility you have attached to this in the first place, which is why the kind of funding things like amateur football clubs or sports events in schools get is largely very different from the one athletes who are being trained in national colleges for things like Olympics who is going to get in the first place. You can't compare those 2 values and you can't compare the kind of utility society derives from both. So the implications of this is that when you transfer majority of government sports funding to this region, you create a funding vacuum that will be filled by other parties like private equity interest parties, like the Emirates, like the Saudi Arabians who are going to buy football clubs in Manchester and Europe, exactly, all of these kinds of things. The implicit thing there is that government lose the amount of public equity it has in controlling the large scale sports figures and sporting societies which it has in its own society, and it primarily becomes a private equity kind of thing. The implications of this is that the utility society government would have derived from these kind of things transfers to other individuals in themselves. We don't think government wants this, right? We don't think government wants a situation where their international sporting leagues are primarily funded by private companies or private institutions. But government bench is going to say, oh, we still think government is still going to give these people money. The only thing there is that they're going to get minority funding coupled with this thing. We think this works in a kind of shareholder capacity where the person who wins more money actually controls more of the whole interest in itself. I'll take a POI from whoever is giving a POI in the tech space. Anyone?
Is it? Cool.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Nike will always invest in the French national team because it attracts the most views and can get the best sponsorships. What will happen to the world famous training of the INF Clairefontaine if the government never invested ground up in Paris?
All right, so your assumption here, the problem with government bench is that they say that, oh, these international sports stars or these people who participate in prestigious tournaments are already big. So when you no longer invest in them, then there's really no more problem. Like these guys can maintain their stance. We don't think this is true. We think that is a continuous developmental process where like sport athletes retire and new ones come up in the event where these guys retire. So maintaining these high prestigious like sporting institutions and sporting like unions, for example, needs government to continuously funding and pick out the best stars among every other person, because that's primarily how sporting is. So you have to continuously put in that funding in terms of sponsoring national training leagues for these individuals to be able to maintain that top grade tier. We don't think these individuals will remain on the top forever, right? That's the kind of misconceptualization these guys get from their side of the house, because we think that is extremely very harmful for them to assume that the kind of top grade competition we already have would still exist in a world where government no longer funds, because we think it's the funding that makes them top grade in the first place. When you remove that funding, you are going to have to battle with an intrinsic devaluation of the way in which we perceive like international sporting stars and international sporting competitions. But the implication of this is, in order to maintain this, you're going to have other parties stepping in to taking the governmental role that has been vacuumed. And in such situations, we don't think government generally wants to lose this kind of interest. We don't think, for example, African nations, for an example, in a bid to help local regions or people who play sports in local areas, would stop funding their international like clubs to go for national competition simply because they want to help people. Why? Because a moral outcome doesn't place a moral obligation on anyone to do anything. We think when you try to argue there's some sort of efficacy that can be gotten from an action, you have to primarily show why there is a principal obligation on the actor to do that in the first place. In an event where there isn't, especially when the comparative is way much better, we still don't buy those kind of ideas in itself. But the last thing you need to show, like we prove in this debate, is that the people who are on the like grassroots level are comfortable where they are. Because we think that when people have interest of becoming international superstars, they primarily engage in a kind of upward mobility kind of activities in terms of going for showmanship competitions where they can want to register, apply to go to the top grade. So they want to opt into that top grade tier competition that's existing. When you bring the funding back to the local regions, you're more likely to make people comfortable with participating at grassroots level. So when you're going to make a lot of money, like participating in a grassroots regional tournament, or you're going to become very popular simply by being a high school sports star, we don't think people would have the incentives to become pro athletes or the pro top competition. We think the kind of the segregation that exists makes it primarily more valuable. Probably win this debate.
I thank the speaker very much for the speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay, just a sec, I'll get my timer ready. Okay. Side government's position today can be summarized very simply through this simple line. We think in the free market, we already have tons of funding that help the prestigious athletes. We think that's the reason why they are prestigious athletes, because we think that the private sector and the free market has been far than sufficient enough in giving them the fame and the resources that they need to actually have their sort of fame and elitism. Contrarily, we think that the reason that grassroots organizations, that lower levels of sports are lower levels of sports is because the private sector does not succeed in delivering them the funding and the resources they need to allow more people to use this sort of skill to actually grow into better athletes in the first place. We think quite simply, anytime in society when we evaluate whether or not government should intervene in a particular sector, we determine it based on whether or not the current system in the free market is sufficient in delivering those resources in the first place or not. And under this simple framework, it is evident that it is the grassroots sports that we should be funding and prioritizing. Before I actually get into my main argument, which is about the idea that I just described, how in the free market, we already have sufficient funding for prestigious sports, but not enough for grassroots sports, I want to talk about some direct refutations to the points provided by the first speaker of side opposition. First of all, they began their speech by this argument saying that your policy or the effects that you're claiming to exist already exist in status quo. Therefore, there's no need for us to do it in the first place. We think this is an incredibly weak line of argumentation, all because there's some benefits that exist to some extent in status quo does not necessarily mean that we can abandon anything that tries to improve it, right? Our argument was very simple. Our argument was that already in status quo, we were getting some people who join sports on a grassroots level, and when they realize that they're really good at it, these people can join more prestigious levels of sports And as a result, they can prosper in this sector. What we're saying is that if we increase the amount of funding that's going to sports in the grassroots, on the grassroots level, we're going to get more people who are attracted to these sports in the first place, more people who have the most elementary level of coaching and education to help them improve, and therefore more people who are genuinely have this talent to take it to the highest level, to be able to actualize this when they realize that they're good at it. We think the reason that in so many less developed countries, for example, we have such low levels of high level athletes is not necessarily because people in those countries are just innately worse at sports. It's because there isn't the grassroots funding necessary to allow people to enter the realm of sports in the first place and therefore realize that they're good at sports, which therefore allows them to pursue it on the highest level. So even though we think this exists to some extent in status quo, we're enhancing this by increasing the level of grassroots participation, which then increases the level of elite participation. So even if that's your end goal, we think we'll pull it far better because we increase a base of people who are capable of ascending to this level in the first place. Second of all, they talked about how it's competitive, and therefore the competitive nature of sports necessitates that the government prioritize people who are best at it, right? We don't understand where this line of argumentation comes from, because as they've said themselves, everything is competitive. Every aspect of society is competitive. Some people are better than others. Some people have more money than others. Some people succeed more than others. We think the fact that it's competitive and there's some winners and losers does not necessarily mean that we should divert all of our attention, or at least most of our attention, to people who are the winners, right? Because we think this is an incredibly perverse way to organize society. If we have the most rich people and the smartest people and people with the most education, we say that because they're the winners, they're the people who have reached the top of this sort of ladder, and therefore we're going to dedicate the amount of funding to them because they're better at it and they've won. We think this is a pretty perverse way to completely neglect the people who don't have the resources at the very bottom to get there in the first place. So we don't think the fact that it's competitive and there's winners and losers necessarily means that the government should only divert this funding to the winners to begin with. Next, they talked about the private sector and why it's so bad for the private sector to step in place of the government. A few problems here. We don't necessarily see how the government stepping away from funding elite sports actually increases the odds of the private sector stepping in instead. We think it's possible that the government will have a lower proportion of the shared investments in elite sports, but we don't necessarily understand why this is such an important thing. Why? Because we think that every single justification you gave for why this is likely to happen is always something that's innate to the status quo, right? You talked about big oil giants in the Middle East buying out soccer companies in Europe. Well, if these are things that happen in the status quo where the government is already dedicating most of their funding to these elite organizations, we don't understand why this is more likely to happen in our world. That's the first issue with this argument. Second of all, if your value is to maximize the success of those who are really good at sports, who already are operating on the highest level, what problem do you have with private companies who are far more capable of providing funding than the government and stepping in and helping these organizations? They're simply doing what you are trying to do over us, but better. So what is your problem with private organizations having an increased role in elite sports compared to the government? This is something that needs more substantiation from side opposition. Before I move on to my main substantive argument, I want to take one POI, if there are any. Okay, seeing as there are none, I want to elaborate on our main argument, which is the idea that quite simply, grassroots organizations don't have funding in the natural system, and this necessitates that the government step in, as they do with any other thing. Why do we think this? We think that at the most basic level, the government has an obligation to fund services that don't receive funding in a sufficient manner in a free market system. We think in prestigious sports, this exists to a significant extent, because if you have prestigious sports, you have the social capital, you have the fame to attract people who view your sport, you have people who will pay tickets, you have people who invest in sports companies and clubs, and we think this will create a significant amount of capital that is necessary to fuel these sorts of elite industries. We think there are more than enough funding delivered to these organizations in a capitalist system, and therefore we don't think the government should step in. We think these sort of self-fueling things that keep this industry going are significantly diminished, if not entirely absent, in the case of grassroots sports. Why? Because if you're not particularly good at a sport, nobody is really going to watch you, no one's really going to want to invest in you, and as a result, there's going to be significant lack of funding that's necessary to get these grassroots organizations going. So these grassroots sports organizations are kind of stuck in a trap where, unlike these elite organizations, they really can't do anything. As a result, we observe that in these cases, grassroots sports organizations quite simply fail in the free market, and therefore it's necessary that the government steps in and fills this void. We think this is particularly valuable if we look around the world in other cases that happen in less developed countries. We think in less developed countries, as soon as we see the reason that they're not very good at sports, as I mentioned before, is not because they lacked funding at the highest level of sports. We think they lack funding because there isn't enough government involvement in the most basic level of people to get the education and the sports involvement that they need. We think every single time we see a country do this and dedicate themselves more towards a grassroots level, we see a significant emergence of people who are rising to this elite level. We think this is something that's been seen in chess in India, for example, which is relegated to the elite. And as soon as the government started funding school programs that integrate chess into education, suddenly in the last 5 years, we've seen it become one of the powerhouses in global chess competition. We think this is one example that illustrates how as soon as we actually divert funding to the sectors that need it most, we see better results. We think to say that because elite organizations are better at sports, the government should provide them. It's like providing tax cuts to rich corporations just because they're rich. This is like providing education to the richest people just because they got the best test scores. We think we should be helping the people who don't have access to these resources, doing it from the ground up and filling the role of government, which is to redistribute resources and help those who don't get delivered these resources in a free market system. Very proud to propose.
Thank that speaker very much for that speech, and call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. So I just want to put on my timer so I don't end up going over time. Is that okay? Just give me a few seconds. All right, let me just get my things in order. Okay. What's up? Okay, I'm coming. Give me 5. Sorry, my younger brother is really on that. Anyway, so I'm going to start in the next 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel. The comparative in this debate is 2 sides. A one world where you continuously invest the majority of sports funding into amateur clubs, or clubs where there's basically the grassroots, like OG tries to contextualize this debate, or on the other end, you continuously invest in intensive training and coaching for people that might actually be absorbed from these very same grassroots individuals and eventually get that exceptionalism status that is very required for them to even not only create some sort of self-determination, but to an extent to ensure that even at a national level, they continuously gain the prestige that is necessary for the entire sporting industry in of itself. This is very important, especially when engaging the entire case that we get from opening government, because there's 2 major things that we get from government. The first idea is that sporting in status quo is extremely discriminatory, and to an extent, it's just comprised of white people. An engagement on that. We think that doesn't necessarily inculcate or actually include sports like the NBA, where you see majority of the basketball players actually Black people. But above and beyond that, we think sport has evolved to an extent whereby you even combine and join people from different geopolitical, even to different continents, having that opportunity, be it from Sudan going to play for Arsenal or going to play for big soccer clubs like Madrid, etc., etc. We think this is exactly what the sports world has evolved to, creating opportunities even for those individuals that exist within those disparities. But secondly, on the idea that these communities don't get adequate funding, and this in of itself is one that is, to an extent, disenfranchising. We think to an extent we could concede, but we think disparities or this inequalities are something that will always constantly exist. But at a point in time in which you then understand that the funding that is created by this government is not always to like give elite sport athletes, but it's always to ensure that the standard that is required for sports to constantly evolve and to constantly exist is constantly there. We think when you have intensive training for people to constantly ensure that even athletes in of itself evolve, you outrightly even make that investment valuable in the first instance, because we think whether we like it or not, athletics, sports in of itself is an investment even made by governments that we're actually debating about right now. So at a point in time in which we don't invest in in things or athletes or players who might not necessarily be able to provide the necessary prestige or even the necessary upward mobility that they want to fight for, we then end up getting this counterintuitive aspect that is existing within their case. I'm going to tell you 3 major things within my debate or within my speech. I'm going to just be talking about how we even get the best form of self-determination on our side, but also how sports in of itself is more likely to be more inclined to the economic aspect of the entire a world that we are trying to fight for. Because when you're looking at sports, like I said, it's an entire industry, be it in soccer, be it the Olympics having different types of sports constantly be played. We think countries invest in this field and this industry so that they can get that returns, which might be the prestige that they need. But above and beyond that, the exceptionalism that comes with these individuals getting the training that they need, getting the adequate exposure that they need. We think when Splendor clearly comes and talks to you about the harms of privatization, OG misses it. Because whether we like it or not, we think at a point in time in which you constantly don't invest in the players that are constantly actually giving back to that country, there's more likely a chance that these players are constantly going to be snatched away from those countries and from those communities. Hence, the investment of itself, it becomes futile. And we think that is a very big problem, because even if you want to look at it on an economic level, we think sports in of itself needs to be given some sort of level of attention. And we think, yes, the grassroots individuals that we outrightly care for, but we think these grassroots individuals are the ones in status quo that are constantly being inculcated within these systems. We think even if you want to look at the likes of Pong, even if you want to look at the likes of individuals that are being incorporated within these elite systems, some of them came from very bad, or let's say grassroots backgrounds in the first instance. But the fact that they managed to get into the system, it actually incentivized them to constantly want to pursue their career, because sporting in this world isn't just about doing it for the fun of it, but it's more likely to do it as a lifetime career. At a point in time in which you refute these individuals of that opportunity, you even fail on the social construct that is obligated upon the government of itself to ensure that people get that self-determination, and out above and beyond, these individuals constantly feel as if they're desired or actually have some sort of role to fulfill within society. We think the entire grassroots aspect that we're supposed to be hearing about in this debate is one where you just focus, maybe even just having schools, having these after sports activities, be it physical ed, but even above and beyond that, what exists in status quo is these recruitment programs that even have students actually being picked out from these communities and actually being incorporated within bigger organizations, be it within the NBA, be it within the soccer arena. We think that's very important for us to understand. But at a point in time in which we allow these individuals to get the intensive training that they need, the incentivization that they get from even getting salaries in of itself, or even getting that exceptional status, is something that we outrightly think is important, especially when we're looking at the second aspect that comes with sports on a competitive level, which is the globalization aspect that we want to continuously inculcate. We think it is important for us to understand that sports for the longest of time has allowed different countries throughout the world to actually interconnect and intertwine. At a point in time in which we don't necessarily invest in the best aspect, or the aspect that outrightly allows us to get exposed in the first instance, we might necessarily have more problems than solutions that the entire government is trying to pose for us. If anyone has a point of information, shoot quickly before I summarize.
Okay, so sporting is primarily, as you said, quote unquote, doing it for your entire career. Why are we funding people who will already be funded by the private sector, who have already made it, instead of those that we can help to make this end?
Panel, whether we like it or not, in their world, whether you start at the grassroots level, they're still going to get to that prestigious level. That is something that they're outrightly conceding within their speeches. What then happens is that you refuse these individuals the opportunity to get that adequate training, to get that state-of-art opportunity to be exposed in the field of athletics that allows these individuals even to get that exceptional status. We think sports is a competitive nature. That's why we even come here to debate. It's a sport. We come to outrightly reveal our competitive aspect of our lives. So at a point in time in which you disapprove of individuals that opportunity, you end up creating the disparities that we don't outrightly want. With this, we've never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker very much for that speech, and I would very much like to call upon the closing government member.
All right, am I audible and visible? Can you guys hear and see me?
Yes, you are, yeah.
Okay. all that the entire opening half has talked about in this debate is somehow benefiting sports. They've talked about how they can potentially get better athletes into sports. They've talked about how the quality of sports might be improved. However, that is not the most important impact in this debate. We don't think that sports in and of itself as an entity becoming better is a meaningful impact. What is a meaningful impact, however, is allowing poor children who never had the opportunity to go to a sporting club, who never had the opportunity to exercise, practice, and learn every day, allowing them that. There are other benefits here at play, which is something that closing government is going to bring to you today. We have two extensions. Number one, about minority sports and especially about female sports, and second, about other benefits like health and like crime that reduces in communities when you have grassroots level funding. But before that, two quick points of rebuttal. First, on OOs, weird idea about how private teams will somehow help grassroots development, and because they do things like scout right now. Two responses. First, no, we don't think that they have an incentive to do this, because they already have the top players coming from these top elite places for sport that you want the government to fund on your side. But second, even if they did, we think all they're going to do is going to untap rich areas and do things like scouting. They do not have an incentive to spend the vast amount of money that it takes into infrastructure. They don't have an incentive to go to black communities and set up infrastructure there. Rather, all that they have an incentive to do is pick off talent from whatever communities they see fit. But the second idea that they had in opening opposition was this weird idea that athletes only join sports if they think that they can make an entire career out of it. Two responses. First, we don't think that is the case, because in the vast majority of instances, people just want to play sports because they like it as a hobby. They want to play sports because they think it's going to be healthy for them and a whole bunch of other things. But second, even if this were true, let's compare both sides, because on which side do more individuals have a higher chance of feeling that they can make it to the top in sports? One where you're only funding these elite places and only funding a few people, or one where you allow infrastructure, where you create a level playing field where all people from all communities think that they have a shot at making to the top when they have these squash courts to play in the first place. Let's then move on to my extension. First, about minority sports and female sports in specific. Right now, the big issue with female sports is that there is not a lot of interest running there. To ensure sustainable access, viewership is most important, because that's the only way that you can get people like sponsors. It's the only way that you can get private players to back these mega leagues that you want to do. But why is viewership low right now? Two reasons. First, we think that women themselves don't want to get into sports right now. Why? First, there are large barriers to entry right now. The best way to remove these barriers to entry is to allow them to try out in school and see the success when they go further. Right now, their families stop them from going into sports in the first place because they don't think that they can do much. But when you have this opportunity available at your school or in your local community, and you try it out and you get better at it, that's when your families can allow you to do that in the first place. But second, they don't have any role models to look up to. Right now, women don't see anyone in their community that they can look up to. There are no local league captains that they can talk to and share their experiences with them. Second, we think all of this is going to change on our side when the government does things like invest in local women's sports leagues, when they do things like create grounds that women can also go to and they can learn and enjoy sports in their own way. Second, we think helping sports we think that we also help sports on whole, because the problem with women's sports is you don't have viewership and hence you don't get funding. And there is no viewership when you don't create it from the ground up, when there are no small leagues. But second, we think private players and investors don't want to create leagues and teams. All they want to do is they want to scout areas and look for good players. But when they start looking for female players, because of structural reasons, there aren't like super great female players in all areas around the world right now. So they don't have talent to tap into. On our side, we change that when we're harnessing talent, when we allow women athletes to like recognize their talent and we give them the platform and infrastructure to come up. That is when all of the private players that OO really wanted to talk about can do things like scouting, and that is when they can start things like a female league of whatever their male counterpart is. But second, we think the government also have a unique, we think the government also has a unique responsibility to do this, because we think women are the most vulnerable stakeholders in this debate. Because let's be honest here, male sports is going to continue on either sides of the house. It is women who are not going to get access on their side. That is only something that you get on closing government. But second, let's talk about benefits outside of sports. And this is a very, very important extension, because all of OG only talked about benefits in sports. They only talked about how sports leagues somehow become better. But we think there are two big benefits outside of sports when you invest at a grassroots level. First, health. We think right now, most people, the working class, the poor people, people in suburbs, people in rural areas, they don't have access to sporting opportunities. Poor kids don't have access to things like backyards. They don't have sporting courts and infrastructure that they can go to. This means they often don't get into sports. Why is that extremely, extremely bad? Two reasons. First, they never get to develop their health. All sports has things like running or jumping or exercises, or they're healthy activities overall. And this is very important because health issues are on the rise. Things like obesity are on the rise, and poor kids have no other place to go to. They can't do things like they can't afford gyms, for instance. And this changes when they have local areas where they can go to. They have local grounds, they have local sports clubs that they can go to. You only get that when you invest at the grassroots. But second, poor kids never get access to things like team building skills. They aren't exposed to these friendly competitive environments of sports. And this is extremely important for their development and their mental development as like a young person. We think that is only something that you get when you allow them the structural access to sport in the first place. We also think that the government has a unique obligation to do this because they're using taxpayer money, and they have an obligation to use it in a way that benefits the vast majority of people. Because if you weigh it out, on their side, you send one athlete to the Olympics, but on our side, you help hundreds of thousands of poor kids create a better well-being, and they get better lives on our side with better health. But second, quickly on crime, we've seen in countries like Brazil and across the US that being in a sports team has benefits for communities on a whole, because it keeps kids in schools and out of the streets where they may be susceptible to harmful influences. Kids in poor households or troubled households go to these gangs because they think that they're providing a family for them. We change that on our side when we allow them an opportunity to go to their local sporting clubs, when we allow them an opportunity to find a team, to find a coach, to find a group of people that they're comfortable with. That is when you have things like reduced crime. Exceptionally proud to propose.
Thank the speaker very much for that speech. I would now like to call upon the closing opposition member.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Give me 1 second, then I'll start. Okay, 1, 3, 2, 1. Government side has an inherent misconception of how does this funding actually looks like. They think this is basically like we're giving money from a government to Ronaldo or to Messi or to Djordjevic, so they now compete and they're good. That's not how this funding works in any case. The fact of the matter is that in the majority of the cases, you are funding 13-year-old Messi who has potential to be one of the future stars, but at the moment, the transition from his amateur play to pro play requires equipment, requires salary so he can actually drop out of school or continue schools but doesn't have to pay the bills and all of the other things. So transition from amateur to pro and building that pro player in this situation is what this funding looks like, which means, if this is true, and it is, which means that all of the benefits from government side are co-opted on our side of the house, because I will tell you in my speech. But let's give you a couple of points of framing, right? This debate is about prioritizing resources, right? We say that we should prioritize resources towards pro play. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't build any community centers, any community football fields and all of these sort of situations. Let alone, some of these fields already exist in a lot of these places, and you require significantly less funding than it requires for you to, pay somebody a living wage so they can actually pursue a certain sport in that ever. But also, but also allocating to amateur sports is inherently biased politically, right? Because like that depends on which region are you going to invest in, what the government is going to do in that sense. If if you're funding for professional play, we have a clear goal of scouting for the best, most talented players, which actually leads to less inequality. They're talking about rich people, but rich people are not using the government funding in the first place because government funding is never sufficient for them. There's pro coaches, pro football club, not just football club, pro clubs that they're going into, pro equipment. They're not necessarily even the beneficiaries of these, how they say, funding that they're trying to talk about. But they're trying to talk about also, there is inequality. Okay, let's move on to they're talking about female sports, right? In this regime, there is no viewership. There is no viewership in female sport. There is no money. The problem is if there's no viewership and there is no money, if you don't pay these women who are pro players salaries to continue the debate of doing this sport, then you only have an amateur league. Then you don't have these role models. Then you don't continue, how they say, to develop this sport. And then these women can ever transition from the amateur play into pro play in the association, which is what is most important. But let's talk about like the framing. Like the first argument is that there is like this set of non-commercialized sports. They're telling me, the private sector is already funding a lot of these sort of situations. This is not necessarily even true for football, that is the most popular thing. It might be true for Premier League or the best leagues in the world, but it's not true for this transition from amateur to pro league, for the second league in Serbia, for even the second league in England, in this association. And that requires local funding for these players to be built up so they can continue on this. This means that for some sports, archery, volleyball, water polo, all of these boxing, all of these sports that don't have enough viewership and all of these things and sponsorships that can fund their careers, means that they cannot pursue that career because they're now in a conundrum. Am I going to be hungry or pursue this sport because they don't have enough funding to do it? But they also don't have equipment that they can compete with. If you're going to like archery, you need best equipment in the association. If you're playing amateur basketball, you need a random ball. This here, you need specific sorts of training, which is much more expensive, and that prohibits poor players and poor people from actually accessing it because rich people can buy that themselves under association. So you can't go to the Olympics under a set of house if you are poor and don't have certain things. So a lot of these people this is very valuable for their identity, for their community, for their family, cannot pursue something that they're talented in, and we're denying them this opportunity and denying them the ability to escape poverty by this. But let's talk about the trickle down that they can create under their set of house. We believe that people who pursue this career in sport, it's very risky. Like you don't know if you're going to become the best in the association. And if you're funding it to somebody, you're not also knowing that they're going to become the best in the association. Some people will succeed, some people will not. We have benefits from both of them. If people succeed, and when people succeed, especially from the poorer communities, the fact that you give them a leg up to succeed means that they have more obligation towards the youth in your country. This is why in the majority of places where football players come from, either Africa or even in Serbia, Novak Djordjevic, the tennis player in the association, he then starts to invest more into the sport that brought him to the place where he is. But in fact, in order for him to be in that place in the first place, and have the ability to invest in youth leagues for tennis, in poor communities having a tennis court, he needs to have this leg up to transition into a pro in the first place under their side of the house. So we believe under our side of the house, we have more funding towards these sports. But even if you don't succeed, the fact of the matter is these people then become these amateur coaches. These people then become a high school coach for basketball that can interest their players in the association. You don't have to be stellarly popular. You just have to have a couple of years of intensive training to be able to pass that knowledge to youth. But also, let's talk about popularity, because that's also a thing that they want to talk about. People are tied to success. People want to watch something be successful. That's why like volleyball games are not watched in majority of the world, but in Serbia it's very much watched because we are very good at it and we are winning a lot of medals in the association. Even women's even women's volleyball, we are celebrating what they're doing in the association, which means that if you can spark this national identity and national pride, that's where you get more interest and more money going into the sports, because people are pushing politicians, people are pushing communities to actually respect the craft and respect the thing that can happen. But also kids are inspired because they see this is something that is a path for them to succeed. And they don't have to start, like they can have one ball and like I've played football with like between 2 trees in the association. You don't have to have a lot of things to start, to people to notice you that you're talented and give you funding by the government that we're talking about. But also trickle down in terms of rich local people, right? It doesn't have to be from the sport. The fact of the matter is, if local people are very prideful of a certain sport, then it's most likely for a random local rich guy to actually build a court to be like, yeah, I'm going to give back to the community. Community will love me. Also, politicians are more incentivized by the fact that people care about this. And also these players are given the platform when they win the Olympic medal or something like this, to go to the television, to first of all talk about their community, what is wrong with their community, is there racism, what is happening, which is what we saw with in America in this association, but also to talk about more funding and how we can secure it and how youth can be more engaged in a certain sport. And this is an opportunity they wouldn't otherwise have if they never transition from amateur to pro, if we cut their funding like government wants to do. That's why you should vote closing opposition. Thank you.
I thank that speaker very much for that speech. I would now like to call upon the member of, the government whip. of this debate, the
Hey, Louis, can you hear me if I talk like this?
yes.
Okay, I will start in very briefly. Снега си екрана. 3, 2, 1. It is a panel that CG calls us out for not responding to them because we outframe their case, meaning the impacts that they claim are included in Milos' case on our side of the house. And after that, whip speaker offers 0 responses to our extension. Just to make that clear at the beginning. What we're going to respond to case in CG and then go through 2 big clashes in this debate and just flag you out how much of unresponsiveness there was side closing government in this debate. Let's go straight forward to CG. First part of their extension is about female sports. Now, this is not necessarily a comment per se, because everything that's said about female sports is also applicable to male sports. So just because saying that you included some minority into argument does not automatically gain you extra points in this debate. But let's go to the meritum of their case and what they really want. Let's cut the bullshit, right? What does access mean? They're saying, oh, we need to build something so that more kids can play basketball. This argument works only, let's take reality check. If there are now football and basketball fields all across the world where kids are standing in queues to play football, so now we need to build them 5 football pitches because or 5 basketball courts in this neighborhood so they can play. This is just not the reality of the matter. The reality of the matter is that kids are not super engaged in sports, and we do not need money in order to make them go, because kids are not going to go to sports if they see commercial on TV or on Instagram. Because I live in Serbia and I see Novak Djordjevic is a very good tennis player, so now I want to play a fucking tennis. And this is what we want to achieve in this debate. Second thing that they so why this matters is because, like, if you think realistically, where does this money goes and what does it do? We don't really know what does it do. They say, oh, more money, so more kids will play, so there will be more good sports. No analysis there whatsoever. But about private funding, there's a couple of things. One, there will be things such as Nike and these people investing. Note, this debate is not about US. This debate is about other 7 billion people who live in this world. And this debate is not only about soccer or basketball. It is about all the sports where Nike and Adidas don't give a single fuck whether to look for scouts who are going to invest all over the country so the money can pay off. So where governments puts money is more in sports like handball, volleyball, water polo, swimming, athletics, gymnastics, and all the other places where Puma doesn't give a single fuck to give money to. So already this argument is pretty much outframed, because this debate is very little about super popular sports in super rich countries where you have tons of private funding, but other 6.5 billion of people who live on this earth who are also presumably important in BP debates that we so often forget to talk about. The point about Mbappe, poor community, then they have access to France. Yes, this is exactly our point. French state should invest money into their national league so they can pour millions of dollars to expensive scouts who are going to go all over the country and search for talented kids, which is argument for side op. Argument for side gov is instead we should build 7 football pitches in Marseille so kids in France can play fucking football, which is not the problem that we are having in the status quo. And even nextly, this debate is about distribution of money. It is not only about exclusion. We are saying we focus on one thing rather than we are focusing on one thing rather than the other. Then there are 2 really important questions in this debate. One refers to trickle-down effect that happens. The other one refers to efficiency in this debate, how we win on both those points. I'll flag out what was all things that were said that are unresponded. One, about more kids, about trickle-down. Okay, first point, about popularity. If you invest more in getting young people to become professionals, and then one of the million that you invest in becomes fucking Novak Djokovic, his popularity is going to push hundreds of thousands of kids to start playing tennis, million times more than if you build safe basketball courts or safe tennis courts all around. We think say this is pretty factually correct. No response to this point. Secondly, about individual funding. Once you produce this guy, Novak Djokovic, he comes back to Serbia and he creates fucking 500 tennis courts, okay? Which is one, more efficient because government doesn't need to give funding to it, so taxpayers don't really pay for it. And two, he as a professional knows much better than government where to put money and how to look for talented tennis players that exist in Serbia. We never get Novak Djokovic without government paying for his equipment, tennis rackets, and these kinds of things. Third thing, funding in this debate is zero-sum game, okay? There is equal amount of government funding. But on our side, we tell you that in countries like Serbia, there is a president who wants to take a photo with Djokovic so he can take quotes, and then after that, he maybe wants to put a couple of €100,000 more into building other tennis courts and all the other stuff. So even if distribution is swayed more towards professionalism, if the quantity rises, right, we would rather have it like this than have it like this. We take all of their benefits and plus some that we have on our side of the house. And fourth, and probably the most important, is expertise trickle down, right? If you push 500 people to be Djokovic, but only one becomes, the other 499 are now almost pros, half amateur, half pros, who can coach thousands and thousands of kids because maybe they didn't earn hundreds of millions of dollars, but they know very well what it takes to be a professional athlete. They know very well about medicine, and those kinds of things. I'll take CG.
Okay, let's take a look at how mutually inexclusive your case is, because in reality, players like Djokovic and like Federer are sponsored by private individuals, Nike and Wilson. Why is it that only if they're sponsored by the government they're going to want to give back?
No, Nike and Wilson do not exist in Serbia, my friend. They do not exist in where 6.5 billion people live. Nike and Adidas exist in UK football players, maybe French football players, maybe US basketball players. If you believe that Nike makes camp in the Balkans or in the Southeast Asia, I think you're very wrong on that. As I said at the beginning of my speech, so that thing doesn't have a standing in this debate. And with this expertise, we get more kids to play, more trainers, more scouts, etc., etc. Second flash is why about efficiency, why it is more efficient. One is about, look, you don't need to put that much money. You build once infrastructure, you don't have to for the next 50 years put that much money into it. Second point is about geography is necessarily discriminatory towards the communities the government worries about, whereas professionalism is not discriminatory. It searches only for talents, as Milos told you. And the third point, if we have pro athletes who become pros, they, with their professionalism, as I said, are much more efficient than governments who puts government apparatchiks who work in government to decide where to distribute these resources. Let me remind you once again that no responses came from these points in Milos extensions. Governments would give men a fish to not let him be hungry for a day. We would teach a man how to fish so he would not be hungry for 100 years. Proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker very much for that speech, and in fact, all of you for a lovely debate. I think you all leave the breakout room, and me and Christopher stay behind. See you back in I can still see you, Belgrade. Can you leave? Can you hear me?